Welcome back to the Buddhist Audio Bookshelf YouTube channel. Today, we continue our reading of Meditation by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, also known as Geoffrey DeGraff. We deeply value your support. Please like and share this audiobook to reach a wider audience, allowing more people to benefit from its wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ensuring you receive immediate notifications as we upload new content. Together, we can spread the teachings of meditation and mindfulness, fostering a community of enlightenment and inner peace. Thank you for being part of our journey to make these profound teachings accessible to all. Let's start today with reading Medicine Timely and Timeless. September 18, 2008. The Buddha often compared himself to a doctor, and the Dhamma was his medicine. When we think about this analogy, it's important to remind ourselves that the Buddha was not a doctor in a modern hospital. You didn't go to him for a shot. He was a traditional doctor, and traditional medicine is a lot more strategic than modern medicine is. The canon gives us a picture of Javaka, the Buddha's own personal physician, telling how he became an expert doctor, and it gives us a good idea of the kind of doctor the Buddha had in mind. Even though part of Javaka's knowledge covered the medicinal uses of every plant he encountered, that wasn't the entirety of his skill. A lot of his expertise lay in his strategies. How to deal with occult patients, how to treat occult diseases. So when the Buddha was saying he was a doctor, he was saying that he was very strategic. When he spoke, it wasn't just a question of saying what's true. That was just the RST question he'd ask before deciding to say something. Is it true? He also made sure that what he'd say was being silent, and that it was timely. In other words, his words were designed to have a species effect, taking the circumstances into consideration to see if this was the right time and the right place to say that particular truth to get the desired effect. This is why when Anathapindika, who was a stream enterer and would seem to be qualified to know, was asked what kind of views the Buddha had, said, "I don't know entirely what views the Buddha has." This was because he realized that when the Buddha taught, he taught strategically. His words didn't necessarily encompass the entirety of his views. So when you read that the Buddha saw the world in this way, or he thought this, he thought that, you have to ask yourself, to whom was he saying that, in what situation, under what conditions? Because as a doctor he had to be strategic. If you've ever had traditional medicinal treatments, you know that they're a lot more varied and strategic than what you'd get in most modern medicine. I've known a couple of cases where a traditional doctor would treat one disease by actually inducing another disease. Once the RST disease had been turned into the second disease, then he could knock out the second disease. What this means is that sometimes you take a particular medicine to induce new symptoms, and then at a certain point in the treatment you have to drop that medicine and take up something else to treat the new symptoms. Some medicines you might take all the way through the treatment. But with others, once the medicine has to be changed, you can't touch the RST medicine. Or in the course of taking the RST medicine, you can't yet touch the second one. So when you look at the Buddha's teachings, you have to ask yourself, which of the teachings apply across the board, and which are designed for a particular stage in the practice? For example, the Buddha makes heavy use of perceptions. He says that we suffer because of our misperceptions of things, seeing constancy in what's inconstant, pleasure in what's painful, self in what's not self, and attractiveness in what's really unattractive. But he doesn't then just go and say, simply turn your perceptions around and that's that. The problem is solved. That's not how it works. The solution is more indirect. Before you take up the three perceptions of inconstancy, stress and not self, he has you develop other perceptions, RST, in particular the perceptions that lead the mind to concentration. While you're here practicing concentration, focus in on your breath. What keeps you with the breath? A perception, a mental label that says breath. And a lot of the concentration practice is learning how to gain a perception of breath that you can hold in mind for long periods of time with a sense of ease, a sense of well-being. You test different perceptions of the breath to see which ones hold, in other words, which ones you can stick with. This would seem to go against the perception of inconstancy, and it does. You're actually looking for a perception you can hold on to as constant. You want to see the breath as something consistent and pleasant you can stay with. For example, if you see the in-breath and the out-breath as two radically different things, it's going to be hard to stay with them comfortably. Because you have to keep switching back and forth between the two perceptions. But if you see the breath energy as something present in the body all the time, try to hold that perception in mind. You'll come to sense the breathing process in a different way. The breath is always there, it's just a matter of letting the in-breath meld with what's already there. Then you check to see whether what's there is getting pumped in too full or squeezed out too much. When you see breath energy in a constant way, it's a lot easier to adjust the breath in a way that feels right, feels healthy, feels nourishing. You can gain a sense of fullness without feeling stewed. When you breathe out, you can begin to sense the point where you've breathed out too much. You're squeezing the breath energy, depleting yourself of breath energy in ways you don't need to. For the time being, you simply want to hold on to that perception of the breath as constant and pleasant, something you can gain some control over. Use the three perceptions only when you end the mind being pulled away from the breath to other things. You look at the happiness, the pleasure that comes from chasing after those other things, and you learn to see it as less constant than the pleasure that comes in staying with the breath. More stressful, less under your control. So at this stage in treating your illness, your primary focus is on constancy, on seeing the breath as always there. Ajahn Lee says that you want to see what's constant in what's inconstant. If you see everything as inconstant, he says, you're missing some important aspects of the training. The example he gives is symbolic. Your lower lip has never turned into your upper lip. That's something constant about your lower lip. Your eye has never turned into an ear. That's something constant about your eye. In the same way, there are some aspects of the breath energy in the body that really are constant. As long as you're alive, there will be breath energy in the body. And you can learn to use that fact to your advantage. Just stick with that perception of breath and see how the underlying breath energy in the body goes through small fluctuations. You hold on to the idea that breath is constantly there, simply that it's sometimes stewed in too full, sometimes squeezed out until it's too depleted. But you can learn to adjust the rate of your in-breath and out-breath, to see the in-ness and the out-ness as secondary and the presence of breath energy in the body as primary, the given you hold on to. That's how you use perception at this stage in the game. When your concentration is solid enough, then you can start using the three perceptions to take the concentration itself apart. But until you've reached that stage, you don't want to think in those terms. If you start out with three perceptions and try to use them as your medicine to treat everything that comes along, it's very hard to get the mind into concentration. So realize that there are stages in this treatment. Your mind is sick. What's it sick with? Greed, anger, and delusion. And this is the treatment. It has its different stages. You try to get as constant and easeful and controlled a state of mind as you can. You're actually ting against those three perceptions. But it's only when you GHT against a truth that you know how true it is, how far it's true, and where its limitations are. So remind yourself that you're engaged in a strategy here. Don't try to jump the gun, wanting to go straight to the three perceptions to get everything done with so you can get on with your life. The practice has its rhythms, just as the treatment of a disease has its rhythms. Sometimes you might want to ask the doctor ahead of time, how many months do I have to stay in this stage of the treatment before I switch it around? He'll probably say, well, it really depends on how long the body takes to respond. And it's the same with concentration practice. How many years does it take? Ajahn Fuang would often say, don't ask. Just do what needs to be done. When the mind gets ripe, whether it's fast or slow, the important thing is that it's ripe for insight, ripe for other stages of using perception. In the meantime, don't try to second-guess the Buddha. If this is your stage of treatment, stick with it. Trust that the Buddha was an expert doctor. There are a lot of paradoxes in his strategies, but the strategies have worked for more than 2,500 years. They deal with elements that are universal in all people's minds, regardless of where you come from, what age you live in. That's why the Buddha said the Dhamma is timeless. It's not something that was true only in the time of the Buddha. It's true across time. The time-sensitive part is simply which stage you're in the treatment of your disease. So try to apply the Buddha's teachings in a timely way. That's how you'll now get to the ultimate timelessness that the whole training is aimed at. Total freedom from disease. Preparing to die well. February 20, 2009. There's a famous passage in the canon where a young monk, Ven. Rathapala, is visited by King Karavya. The king asks him, "Why did you ordain? After all, you've had a lot of wealth, you had no loss in your family, no health problems. You've got everything a young man looking forward to the pleasures of sensuality can hope for. So why did you ordain?" Rathapala replies that he had reacted on 4 Dhamma summaries from the Buddha. These 4 summaries are mentioned nowhere else in the canon, but they were lessons Rathapala claimed he learned from the Buddha. 1. The world is swept away. It does not endure. 2. The world offers no shelter. There is no one in charge. 3. The world has nothing of its own. One has to pass on, leaving everything behind. And 4. The world is insouciant, insatiable, a slave to craving. Then Rathapala explains them to the king. The RST3 he explains with reference to issues of aging, illness, and death. The world is swept away. The king says, "What does that mean?" In response, Rathapala asks him, "When you were young, were you strong?" The king says, "Yes, I was strong in arm, strong in leg. In fact, sometimes I think I had the strength of 2 men. How about now?" The king replies, "I'm now 80. All my strength is gone. In fact, sometimes I think of putting my foot one place, and it goes someplace else." So the RST summary has to do with aging. It also has to do with anicca, inconstancy, impermanence. The world is swept away. Things keep changing all the time. And as for a body, it develops for a while, and then starts to age and just falls apart. The second summary. The world has no shelter. There is no one in charge. Rathapala illustrates this with the truth of illness, and it's a truth about suffering as well. He asks the king, "Do you have a recurring illness?" The king says, "Yes, I have a wind illness. Back in those days, they believed that if you had shooting pains and cramps in the body, it was caused by a disturbance of the wind element. Sometimes I'm in so much pain that people gather around me in anticipation of my death." So Rathapala asks him, "Can you order the people who have gathered around you to share out the pain, so that you feel less pain?" The king replies, "No. Of course not. Even though I'm king, I'm not in charge of the pain. I have to put up with whatever pain there is. There is no one in charge." So that puts together the teachings on illness and dukkha, stress and suffering. The third summary. The world has nothing of its own. One has to pass on, leaving everything behind. The king says, "What do you mean? I have stores of gold and silver. So how can you say the world has nothing of its own?" Rathapala says, "Can you take those stores of gold and silver with you when you die, or do you have to leave them behind?" "Oh, of course, I have to leave them." So the third summary has to do with anatta, not self, and death. So you see in these RST3 summaries a parallel between, on the one side, the 3 characteristics or 3 perceptions of inconstancy, stress, and not self, and on the other side the 3 Deva messengers, aging, illness, and death. Death is the big not self teaching. There are so many things we hold on to in life that, as death comes, we have to let go. This is one of the reasons why meditation involves so much practice in letting go, letting go, letting go. Because most of us tend to hold on. And yet no matter how tightly we hold on to things, they're going to be ripped from our grasp as we die. So it's best to learn how to let go skillfully beforehand. Otherwise we'll be stuck with that fourth Dhamma summary. Being insatiable, ding. Things insouciant, we're a slave to craving. Craving is what makes us pass on to another life, where we try to latch on again. The Buddha compared the process of dying to an aim leaping from a house array to another house next door. In order to make the leap, it has to depend on the wind element in the air. Nowadays we'd call it oxygen as its support as it goes from one house to the next. In the case of dying, craving is the support that leads from one lifetime to the next. The Buddha doesn't talk about what makes the leap from lifetime to lifetime, because we're not responsible for the what. Instead, he talks in great detail about the act of leaping itself, how the process happens, because that is our responsibility. It's something we can see happening in the present moment. Something we can understand to the point where we know how to choose not to participate in it. We can choose not to fall for it again and again, craving for things that are not really ours. This is why we have to see the world as empty, for otherwise we fall under the power of the king of death. The desire to keep on getting reborn again. Think about that. The desire to be reborn is the king of death, lording over our hearts. To gain our freedom, to get out of our slavery, we've got to learn how to let go. And the letting go has to be very thorough. There's a passage where Anathapindika is dying. Then Sariputta comes to see him and starts telling him how to let go. First you let go of the objects of your senses. Then you let go of the senses themselves. Then you let go of your consciousness of the senses, your consciousness of what's going on in your mind, your consciousness of consciousness itself. You let go of that too. And Anathapindika starts to cry. He's never heard this teaching before. All those years he spent with the Buddha, yet the Buddha never mentioned it to him. There's a lot of controversy in the tradition as to why this was so. But the important point is that that's the teaching at the moment of death. You've got to learn how to let go, even of your consciousness of consciousness. What is there left? Well, that's something you end out in the practice. This is why so many of the Ajahns in Thailand refer to meditation as practice in dying. We gain practice in letting go and seeing for ourselves what's left when everything gets let go. But to gain practice in letting go, we need to do more than just let go. We also have to develop skillful qualities of mind. This is why the Buddha has 4 noble truths. If there were just one duty in the practice, whatever arises, just let go, you'd only need 1 noble truth. But there are some things you have to comprehend, some things you have to let go of, some things you have to realize, some things you have to develop before you can really let go of them all. In terms of the developing, you work on the precepts. In one sense, this is a form of letting go. You let go of your desire to do and say unskillful things. But it's also a form of developing. You have to develop a strong conviction that the sacrifices you might have to make in observing the precepts are really worth making, that there are some things of greater value to be gained by letting go of the pleasure derived from those unskillful activities. Without that conviction, you can't change your unskillful habits. So you've got to develop that conviction, keep it strong. Then there's concentration, which also involves both letting go and developing. The developing involves finding a good solid center inside and maintaining it, looking after it. You work with the breath to make the breath comfortable, so that it's easier to stay here, and you work with your perception of the breath, so you can calm things down and make things more and more quiet inside, both in terms of what's called the physical fabrication of the breathing, and the mental fabrications that are the feelings and perceptions. Sometimes there's a perception of light, sometimes there are perceptions of beings coming to visit you, all the nimittas or signs or visions we hear about. You've got to let those go, calm them down, because they can be disturbances. Back when I was studying with Ajahn Fuang, there were times when his lay students would sit meditating with him, and some of them would start having visions. He had this uncanny ability, as many of them said, that within a second or two after a vision had appeared, he'd ask, "What's going on in your meditation over there?" They'd say, "Wow, there's a vision." Then he'd tell them what to do with the vision. Of course, a lot of people listening in were wondering, when am I going to have my vision? But as he explained, it wasn't because the vision was something special that he gave it so much attention, it was because it was an obstacle you had to get past. It's one kind of perception you have to let go of to calm things down inside. But there are also perceptions you have to develop about how the breathing process actually works in the body, especially if you end breathing laborious. If it takes a lot of air to breathe in, much of that has to do with the perception of what you're doing as you breathe. If your perception is that all you have to breathe through is the nose, it can be very restrictive. Think instead of all the pores in your skin opening up so that the breath can come in and out of the pores. And there are channels of breath in the body through which things can be connected. Think of every little cell in the body being connected, every little cell. And the breath energy is just waiting outside the body to come in. You don't have to pull it in. Just open up the pores and it'll come in on its own. If you hold these perceptions in mind, they change the way you breathe. The breathing gets a lot calmer. The mind gets a lot calmer. You're calming down what are called mental fabrications. You can also calm down the feeling side of mental fabrication as well. Sometimes there are strong feelings of rapture or thrill going up and down the spine. You get goosebumps, intense feelings of fullness as if you're going to drown. Sometimes it's very pleasant and other times very unpleasant, as if you're losing control. You start to pulsate or throb, and when that happens you're certainly not calming the mind down. So remind yourself that there are many levels of breath energy in the body. There's the gross level, which is what you're focused on, but there are more subtle levels you can tune into, like tuning from a radio station playing rock music to one that's playing something very quiet, peaceful, and soothing. So even though the waves of the rock station are still here in the air, you're not focusing on them. You're focusing on the radio waves coming from the station playing Arvo Part. Quiet, calm, soothing music. It's the same with the breath, the same with the feelings that can come from the breath. Try to tune into the more subtle feelings of stillness and ease, of neither pleasure nor pain. Tune into that sense of equanimity. That way you calm down the mental fabrication. It's by holding on to these more subtle perceptions, cultivating and developing them, that you're able to let go of grosser things. Which means that the path begins by combining developing and letting go. Even though eventually we try to let go of all states of becoming, we do that by developing a skillful state of becoming, right concentration of the mind, which gives a standpoint from which we can gain practice in letting go of grosser pleasures, grosser attachments. The main attachments you let go when you're developing concentration are the hindrances, beginning with sensual desire. That's a big one. As the Buddha said, the reason we're afraid of death is because we're afraid we're going to have to let go of our sensual pleasures. And we will have to let go of our sensual pleasures. The problem is if we haven't had any practice in letting go of sensual pleasures, our craving will go straight to where we hope to end more sensual pleasures after death. And who knows where that may be. Ajahn Mun comments that, during one stage in his many past lifetimes, he got zated on the sensual pleasures of being a dog. For 500 lifetimes he was a dog because he was stuck on that level of sensuality. Ajahn Fuang was once visited by some people who'd been studying Abhidhamma. They had heard he was a good teacher, but they didn't know what he taught. He was there in Bangkok, so they went to see him and asked what he taught. He said, "Well, sit down, close your eyes, focus on your breath." They said, "Oh no, we can't do that. If you focus on the breath, you'll get stuck in jhana and be reborn as Brahmas." Ajahn Fuang replied, "What's wrong being reborn as a Brahma? Non-returners are reborn as Brahmas. And at any rate, being reborn as a Brahma is better than being born as a dog." The point he was getting at is that non-returners have gone beyond sensual attachment, sensual passion. Dogs are still attached to sensuality. And even though these people had learned Abhidhamma, had done all sorts of vipassana, they still were coming back to their sensual passions. They could be headed back to dogdom. The only way to avoid that fate is to let go of sensual passion, and the only way to do that is to develop another alternative to pain aside from sensual pleasure. Practicing right concentration is precisely what gives you that alternative, another place to go. As the Buddha once said, if you haven't found another source of pleasure better than sensual pleasure, then even though you know the drawbacks of sensuality, you're just going to keep going back to it, back to it, back to it. So you've got two duties here. To provide an alternative to sensual pleasure and to see the drawbacks of sensuality, to see why you go there, to see that the allure of sensuality is really false and deceptive. It pulls you into doing things and getting obsessed with things that have no real value and can actually harm you. They dull the mind, make it intoxicated. As the Buddha said, this kind of pleasure is blameworthy, causes harm to yourself, harm to other people, and in addition to the bad karma that often comes with getting involved in that kind of stua, the mind gets dulled. Your vision gets restricted because when you're attracted to something of that sort, it's usually to certain details. You focus on some things and willfully ignore all the things right next to them. You focus on the skin and forget that just a millimeter under the skin is some pretty disgusting stua. As you go deeper and deeper in, it gets even worse, right there in that very same body. Then you turn around and focus on what the sensual passion does to your mind. Everything gets very dulled and narrowed down. But if you don't know anything better than the pleasure you get from that, that's the pleasure you keep going back to. There's a story they tell in Thailand of a dog who was changed into a prince. A princess met him, fell in love with him, and prevailed on her parents to let her marry him, even though they didn't know him. He looked like a prince, acted like a prince, but they didn't know what kingdom he came from. But she was really in love with him, so she convinced her parents that he was a good prince worthy of being her husband. Yet this prince, even though he looked like a prince on the outside, still had the passions of a dog. One day the princess found him in the bathroom eating shit out of the toilet, as dogs do in Thailand. So of course he was thrown out of the palace. Went back to his life as a dog. That's a lot like what our mind is like. We go for the rened bliss of concentration for a while, then we turn around and go looking for the shit in the toilet. So you've got to see the drawbacks of those passions. They do have their allure, but you've got to weigh their allure against their drawbacks and try to develop this alternative source of pleasure so that you can have some place to stand and can let go of that passion. As the Buddha said, when you reach non-returning, you've mastered concentration at the same time that you've been able to get beyond sensual passion. That guarantees that you're not going to go for dogdom or any of the other sensual passion realms. But still there's more to let go of. Even though the Brahma realm is a very rened state, rened states don't last as long as the Brahmas think they do. There are many instances in the suttas where Brahmas are totally deluded on this point. They think they've gone beyond anything the Buddha knows, so the Buddha has to go up to their Brahma heavens and subdue their pride, to show them that they still have more to let go of, that there is something the Buddha himself has gone beyond, but they haven't. In one of the suttas, the Buddha challenges a Brahma, Bhikku Brahma, to disappear from him, but Bhikku Brahma can't do it. The Buddha sees him wherever he tries to hide. The Buddha then succeeds in disappearing from Bhikku Brahma and states in a loud voice that he has found a level of consciousness that Bhikku Brahma hasn't known, that's not known through the senses, that's not experienced through sights, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations, or ideas sensed through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, or mind. It's beyond the six senses entirely. It's only when you hit that you're really safe. Which means you have to learn how to let go of all the senses. So you try to let go of sensuality and then of the senses entirely, the contact based on the senses, the feelings based on that contact, and then the consciousness of all these things. It's a very radical letting go. But before you can do that, you've got to develop mindfulness, concentration, alertness, all the qualities of the path. Then when the path is done, it gets let go of, too. Like having a set of tools that you use to work on the mind. When the mind has been fully shaped, fully developed, you put the tools down. This is how we prepare for death so we can learn how to do it well. As Ajahn Lee said, most people die without any rhyme or reason, ailing around and latching on to whatever the mind happens to think of in those last moments. And it's capable of latching onto all kinds of stew if you haven't trained it. If you have trained it, you have more control over it. It's the same as when you're meditating. As you see the mind occurring owed to yet another thought which develops into a little thought world, a little becoming, you learn how to catch it and stop the process more and more quickly. Then you realize that this skill is not just a matter of mindfulness and alertness, but also of your sense of values. You have to undo the desire to go into those thought worlds, to see them as interesting or worthwhile. You've got to train the mind so that it doesn't get pulled in, doesn't get hoodwinked by ashy lights and sensuous curves, and all the allure of these different worlds. This is why the skill of discernment is also a matter both of developing and letting go. You have to develop the right sense of values so that you can really let go of unskillful things. As you develop this skill in your meditation, you're closer and closer to having a skill that's capable of facing death and handling it well, so that you have your protection. Death is going to happen regardless, but you can protect your mind from dying in an unskillful way. You do that by learning to live in a skillful way. In all your actions, in all your words, and in the way you handle your mind. So fortunately, learning how to die skillfully is no different from learning how to live skillfully. You cover both issues while you're here as you practice. So try to be heedful. Heedful doesn't mean simply being diligent and busy with the practice. It also means having a strong sense that our actions make all the difference, and that we don't have any time to waste. We have to focus our energies on the areas that really will help us in the event, say, that a little blood clot starts getting the wanderlust, roaming through your bloodstream, wandering here, wandering there, and nally whoops, gets lodged in your heart, and that's it. Or that huge earthquake they keep warning us about. These things can happen at any time. So you've got to be prepared. Heedfulness means seeing that there are dangers here in the mind, and it really behooves you to work on them as quickly as you can, to maintain your focus, and not let it get distracted into ways of wasting what little time you've got. You've got this breath, this breath, this breath. As the Buddha said, if you're on top of each breath, realizing, I'm fortunate that I've got this one more breath to practice the Buddha's teachings, that's when you're counted as heedful. So don't let this breath be wasted. Equanimity isn't nibbana. June 16, 2009. As we sit here meditating, we're engaged in a type of karma. It's called the karma that puts an end to karma. But this doesn't mean that it burns away old karma. Old karma doesn't burn. One of the great ironies in the history of Buddhism is that some of the teachings the Buddha explicitly attacked are nowadays attributed to the Buddha himself. One of these is the idea that simply by learning how not to react to anything in the present moment, you're not just refraining from creating any new sankharas, you're also burning away old sankharas, old karma. But there's a passage where the Buddha actually attacks the idea that you can burn old karma. In fact, he gets quite satirical about it. He goes to see some Jains who believed that they could burn old karma by submitting themselves to different kinds of austerities, that the pain in the austerity was the burning of old karma. He said, "Can you measure how much karma you burned today? How much karma you burned yesterday? Do you actually see the karma burning?" Of course the answer is no. "And what about the pain caused by your austerities? What's that?" They replied, "This is just the old karma burning up." He said, "Have you noticed that when you don't do your austerities, there's no pain?" Here he's making the point that when you experience the results of karma, it's not just the results of past karma. It's also the results of your present decisions. If the Jains didn't practice austerities here and now, they wouldn't be experiencing those pains here and now. In fact, your present actions are the most important part of the karmic mix. This is the lesson of the karma of meditation. Our present decisions, what we're going to do with the mind, what we're going to focus on, how we develop it. That's the karma we witness as we meditate. So you want to focus on doing things that help you understand what's going on in the mind right now. What is this process of intention? How does the mind create an experience of pleasure? How does it create an experience of pain out of the raw material of old karma? This is why right view is at the beginning of the path, because right view itself begins with the understanding that our actions are important and that the intention in the action is what makes all the difference. This means that issues of karma are issues of the mind. You look into the mind to see its doing, to see where you're adding any unnecessary element of stress. The Buddha located that unnecessary element in craving and specifically in 3 types of craving. The RST is craving for sensuality, and here sensuality doesn't necessarily mean sensual pleasures. The Buddha makes the point that our intentions for sensuality are what we're really attached to. The idea of sensual pleasure, the activity of thinking about sensuality, is a lot more attractive than the actual pleasure itself. You can obsess about the idea over and over and over again, whereas the actual pleasure, once you've experienced it, quickly grows stale and is gone. Then you have to nd another one to replace it. But ordinarily we don't get so upset about replacing it, because then the new pleasure provides more fodder for our sensual obsessions, and as long as we can keep on obsessing, we feel we're okay. So our craving for sensuality, this tendency of the mind to keep obsessing about, planning about, how it's going to experience different sensual pleasures, that's what we're really attached to. We really cling to that, feed on that. It's our fodder. So that's the RST kind of craving. Second is the craving to become something, in other words, to take on an identity in a species world of experience. The identity often plays into the world plays into the identity. Whatever identity you build around a desire will then determine the parts of the world you pay attention to, in terms of whether they help or hinder you from attaining that desire. At the same time, whichever world you're thinking about right now, whether it's the world of sports, politics, or your family, will then determine the kind of identity you want to take on in that world. And we crave these things. We feel diminished if we're unable to assume an identity in a particular world that we think is important, interesting, or attractive. And then there's craving for non-becoming, in other words, the desire to destroy whatever identity you've had, whatever world you may be experiencing, when you tire of it. These 3 types of craving are the activities that add the unnecessary sewering. People sometimes assume that you can go beyond these 3 types of craving simply by learning to be non-reactive. But I've never seen the texts list right non-reactivity as a factor of the path. Instead, the path is largely about doing, developing and letting go. You want to develop skillful qualities and abandon unskillful ones. Like right now, we're developing right ear, right mindfulness, and right concentration. These are sankharas. Things we do, things we fabricate. Sometimes non-reactivity gets inserted into the path under the factor of right mindfulness. But the Buddha never denied mindfulness as non-reactivity. Mindfulness in his lexicon means the ability to keep something in mind. And there is such a thing as right mindfulness and wrong mindfulness. Wrong mindfulness is when you keep in mind desires that get you worked up about the world. Right mindfulness is when you take any of 4 frames of reference and keep them in mind as a basis for right concentration. Now, when the Buddha teaches concentration, he does start out with non-reactivity or equanimity as a prerequisite. Before he teaches Rahula breath meditation, he tells him RST to make his mind like earth. When disgusting things are thrown on the earth doesn't react. Then he adds, make your mind like water. Water doesn't get disgusted when it has to wash away disgusting things. Make your mind like fire doesn't get disgusted when it burns disgusting things. Make your mind like wind. Wind doesn't get disgusted when it blows disgusting things around. You try to make your mind imperturbable like the elements. So here there would be an element of non-reactivity. But this non-reactivity is for the purpose of putting your mind in a position where it can observe things clearly, and in particular, to observe your actions and their results in a patient, reliable way. Because when you start working with the breath, you're not just looking at the breath in a non-reactive way. You're working with it, playing with it, mastering it through experimenting with it. And you want to be able to judge the results of your experiments in a fair and accurate manner. The Buddha once recommended to the monks that they practice breath meditation, and one of the monks said, "I already do that." The Buddha asked him, "What kind of breath meditation do you practice?" The monk said, "I learn how not to hanker after the past, not to hanker after the future, and to be equanimous toward the present, as I breathe in, as I breathe out." And the Buddha said, "Well, there is that kind of breath meditation, I don't deny it. But that's not how you get the most out of breath meditation." Then he went into the 16 steps as the way you do get the most out of breath meditation. Now, if you look carefully at those steps, you'll see that they involve a lot of willing, a lot of training of the mind to develop certain qualities. You don't just sit here and watch whatever breath comes up willy-nilly, or pretend that you're not playing any intentional role in shaping the breath. Instead, you're explicitly told to explore that intentional role, RST, by being aware of the whole body as you breathe in and breathe out, then by calming the breath, calming the effect that the breathing has on the body, calming the intentional element that goes into the breath, making it more and more ren-ed, so that you can give rise to a sense of ease and rapture. Then you notice how these feelings of ease and rapture play a role in shaping the mind, and how your perception of the breath plays a role in shaping the mind. You try to calm the impact of that role, make it more ren-ed. Then you see what the mind needs. Does it need to be gladdened? Does it need to be steadied? Does it need to be released from anything it's holding on to? How do you breathe in a way that helps accomplish that? How do you play with your perception of the breath, your perception of your feelings, in order to accomplish that? What other topics like the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, or recollection of death can you bring to mind to accomplish that? In other words, what kinds of physical, verbal, and mental fabrications can you master to bring the mind into balance? These are all things you do with the breath, things you do with directed thought and evaluation, with feeling and perception. And the equanimity here is simply allowing you to observe clearly what's happening, so you can do these things more effectively. In the process, you see more clearly what you're actually doing. You're using the breath to feed the mind. This is one of the underlying images throughout the Buddha's teachings, that the mind is hungry. This is why we sewer. We're hungry for form, feeling, perceptions, thought fabrications, and consciousness. We sewer because we cling to these things. The word for clinging upadana also means to take sustenance from something. You feed on things, and it's because you feed that you sewer. The Buddha's solution is not simply to say, well, just stop feeding because there's no really good food out there. That would be a very defeatist kind of teaching. And it wouldn't be very effective. It would be as if you were saying, okay, you're hungry, but you learn how not to be hungry by realizing there's no such thing as good food. That doesn't work with the body, and certainly doesn't work with the mind. The way to stop the mind from being hungry is to feed it so well that it's never hungry again. This is where the analogy between the body and the mind breaks down. There's no way you could ever put the body in a position where it's totally free from hunger, but you can do that with the mind. And you do that not simply by learning how to accept things as unsatisfactory. You feed the mind with the good qualities you're developing. You work on your conviction. Your persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment is healthy food for the mind. These are qualities developed on the path that strengthen the mind. And especially discernment. Understanding what you're doing, the results of what you're doing, seeing where the unnecessary stress is in all of this, so that you let go of whatever activities are causing that unnecessary stress. When you don't put unnecessary stress on the mind, you lessen its need to feed. In the course of doing that, you run across something unexpected. As you let go of your attachments, you ND that the mind really can touch something that's deathless. The Buddha calls it seeing the deathless with the body, or touching it with the body. It's a total experience. It's not just an idea. It totally replaces your experience of the body. And it totally satisfies your hunger. With your RST experience of it at stream entry, you realize that this would satisfy hunger. However, only the arhants are totally satisfied. They have totally ended their hunger and, from that point on, can be truly equanimous about whatever arises at the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, or the mind. Not because they have become defeatist, saying, well, there is really no happiness to be found, so I might as well give up and just accept the fact. It's because their hunger has truly been satisfied. The mind no longer feels any need to feed on anything at all. That's why they can be equanimous toward the other things that, in the past, they looked to for food. Now they've found a much better happiness that doesn't need to feed. But to get there requires feeding the mind with a lot of mindfulness and concentration that can strengthen your discernment to see these things. The deathless is available at any time, but our discernment isn't net enough, isn't precise enough to detect it. This is why discernment has to be trained. This is why the path is a gradual one. But it does have its turning points, or its sudden drops. The Buddha's image is of the continental shelf of India. A gradual slope and then a sudden drop. The sudden drop is when you detect the deathless. It's a sudden total experience. And a lot of comprehension comes along with that. You know immediately. This is deathless, this is something that time can't touch, because it's outside of time. So the comprehension is instantaneous. We work toward it by gradually refining our discernment. When the path reaches that point, the comprehension goes very deep, very suddenly. It gives a lot of satisfaction. That's why the arhants no longer hunger. Now, the arhants haven't burned any past karma, but beginning with the point of their awakening, they do relate to past karma in a very direct way. All kinds of things can come up from the past, and there can still be a lot of negative stew in an arhant's experience. When Moggallana, for instance, was beaten again and again and again before he nearly died. He realized it was the result of an action in a past lifetime, when he had killed his parents. But his mind wasn't harmed by this, his mind wasn't hurt by it, because he didn't create any suffering out of it. As the Buddha once said, it's through making the mind expansive that you can greatly minimize the impact of any past bad karma. Expansive in terms of the Brahma Viharas. Limitless goodwill, limitless compassion, limitless empathetic joy, limitless equanimity. And also expansive through what's called developing the body and developing the mind. In other words, learning how to make the mind so large that it isn't overcome by pleasure or overcome by pain. The arhant is totally able to do this with no effort, but we work on developing these skills in a gradual way by providing alternative places for the mind to stay. In other words, when there's pain in one part of the body, you can stay with the comfortable sensations you develop through concentration in another part of the body. You can will yourself to some extent not to be overcome by these things, to be equanimous to these things, but that willing is impermanent and doesn't totally solve the problem. Only when you've reached the deathless do you have another source of pleasure that totally overwhelms the experience of pleasure and pain. It keeps you from being overwhelmed by ordinary pleasure or pain. This sort of equanimity comes from a much deeper source. It doesn't have to be willed, and so it's totally reliable. This is why, from the outside, nibbana looks a lot like equanimity. There's a great deal of misunderstanding around this point. It looks like equanimity, but it's not. In fact, you have to go beyond all the various levels of equanimity around the senses, the equanimity of all the highest levels of concentration to a state of non-fashioning, if you're even going to get to nibbana. One of the results of attaining nibbana is that you can be totally detached and equanimous toward the six senses, but as the Buddha said, nibbana itself is the ultimate happiness. He doesn't say it's the ultimate equanimity. It's the ultimate happiness. The arhat no longer hungers because he or she is totally satisfied with a happiness that doesn't need to feed. And at that point, karma is ended. They say that the arhat continues to formulate intentions, but each intention is like a seed that's been burnt as soon as it's created. This is the only place where the Buddha talks about burning the intention. He says it's like taking a seed and then immediately burning it so that it doesn't sprout into anything else. How that happens, you'd have to be an arhat to know. But the only way you can get started in understanding the arahant's answer and developing the arahant skill is by really understanding what you're doing right now, understanding your present karma. You can't learn how to have intentions that don't sprout until you've learned how your current intentions do sprout. This is what we're doing as we practice meditation. We're trying to plant good intentions and then watch how they sprout. From that we learn how to give rise to more and more rened intentions, so that they give more and more rened sprouts. At the same time we gain a greater renewment in understanding how karma actually happens. When you nally see through it, you'll know how to do it, but without having it sprout. So you can't simply will yourself to be non-reactive and hope that that will take care of everything, or even think that it's somehow burning a karma, because the willing to be non-reactive is a kind of karma itself. The correct willing here is in trying to develop right mindfulness, right concentration, all the right factors of the path, as skillfully as possible. And in developing these skills, you gain a lot of discernment. The things you know the most clearly are the things you do yourself. This means that you should learn how to do this really, really skillfully, so you understand it through and through. You comprehend it to the point where you develop dispassion for it, and in developing dispassion, that's when you stop. You know how to stop because you know what you've been doing. This is how the karma of the path leads to the end of karma. It teaches you to understand karma so thoroughly that you can plant seeds that don't sprout. You don't have to sewer from your past karma, and you're not sewering from present karma. The mind is no longer hungry. So it doesn't feed on its karma, past or present, because it's found the happiness that eliminates any further need to feed. You can't eat the Buddha. August 7, 2008. When you come across a situation where a friend is in pain or sewering, in mental distress, and you can help the friend overcome the pain, get over the distress, it gives rise to a very good feeling in the heart. The problem is that there are other times when we're with other people who are in pain and we can't reach them. This is especially true around issues of birth, illness, and death. Sometimes you have a newborn child, and the child is crying and crying and crying. No matter what you do, the child won't stop. It seems hard to believe that there can be so much pain and anguish in such a little tiny body. But there it is. And you can't reach the child. Or when someone is very ill and demented, you often can't reach that person. They're in their own private world, sewering their own private pains and torments. And especially at death, there comes a point where even before the actual moment of death, you realize that the person is beyond you. You can't reach in and help, no matter how much you might want to. That's when you realize the extent to which pain is a very private matter, the extent to which anguish and sewering are private matters. We'd like to think that we can help one another through these things, but there's a lot that each person can do only for him or herself. Even the Buddha couldn't save other people. There were many people he couldn't even teach. He taught only those who could be taught, in other words, those who were willing to take responsibility for their own sewerings. The pain of aging, illness, and death is one of the RST topics the Buddha brings up in his RST sermon, which we chanted just now. And he says that our sewering doesn't come from a lack of help from other people, it comes from our own lack of skill inside. Our knowledge isn't skillful, our desires aren't skillful. And this is something that only we can take care of ourselves, because no one can teach another person to be skillful. You can teach people how they might try to train themselves to be skillful, but you can't take your skill and put it in somebody else's head or hands. They have to learn how to observe from within what kind of thinking is skillful, what kind of acting, what kind of speaking is skillful, and what kind is not. If they themselves engaged in unskillful habits, they've got to learn how to overcome those habits and replace them with more skillful habits. We can't do this for one another. It's a personal, individual matter. This is why the Buddha taught the way he did. He had developed the skill, and he explained to other people how they could develop the skill as well. He acted as an example, he showed the way, but that was as far as he could go. From that point on, it was up to the people he taught to develop the skill on their own. Someone once asked the Buddha why some people, When he taught them, got the results and gained awakening, while other people didn't. Was there something wrong with his teaching? Was he playing favorites, giving the right teaching to some and not to others? The Buddha responded, have you ever given directions to someone on how to follow the road to Rahagaha from Nalanda? The man said, yes. And did everybody get there? Well, some people didn't follow my instructions, the man said. They went astray. Was it your fault that they went astray? The man said, no. I gave the same instructions to everybody. And the Buddha said it was the same in his case. He gave the right instructions to everyone. Some people followed them, some people didn't, but it was beyond his power to force them to. In this way, the Buddha keeps throwing the practice back at us. It's up to us to deal with our own lack of skill, to gore out where our thoughts are unskillful, where our attitudes are unskillful, where the way we look at things is unskillful, and then make a change. He wants us to make ourselves skillful. He wants us to make ourselves strong. The most common image at the front of every Buddhist meditation hall is of the Buddha sitting there meditating. He's not nailed to a cross. He doesn't offer himself as food. Basically, he's showing us. This is how you learn how to feed yourselves, so that you eventually reach the point where you don't need to feed anymore. You develop internal strengths, conviction, persistence, mindfulness, concentration, and discernment. These are qualities we all have to some extent, but we've got to learn how to strengthen them, and they in turn make the mind stronger. So our food here isn't bread and wine. Our food is concentration. The Buddha compared the different levels of concentration to different types of food. The rst jhana, he said, is like grass and water. As you work up through the other jhanas, you get rice, beans, and nali honey, sugar, and ghee. These are our foods on the path. They're foods we have to learn how to ex within ourselves. We have to become our own cooks. The ingredients are all here. It's simply a matter of putting them together and learning how to nourish ourselves with them. So instead of promising us an unending source of food from outside, he's teaching us how to feed from within, strengthening the mind ultimately to a point where it doesn't need to feed anymore. When you're in that position, you're not the only one who been TS. The people around you been T as well. You're no longer forcing them to provide you with the food you want. I remember once hearing a Dhamma teacher saying he didn't want to live in a world where there was no sewering, because he wouldn't be able to exercise his compassion. He apparently didn't stop to think of what a self attitude that is. You want the gratification that comes from exercising your compassion, so you need other people who sewer. What kind of compassion is that? Ideally, you should want a world where no one is sewering, where, as we chant every night, they can look after themselves with ease. And the only way to do that is to teach people how to ex their own food and learn to be more skillful inside. Some people will want to comply and some people won't. That's where you have to develop equanimity. You don't grasp onto them saying, please stay here in sewer so I can feel good about being compassionate. That's just another way of saying, even though it hurts. You to stay, please be here for me when I need you. The Buddha's Nalnibbana was the opposite of that, and it was an amazing act of kindness. He showed us that the best thing a person can do is to end true happiness within, and then get out of the food chain. That's the example he left for us. In EACT, he was showing that your pursuit of true happiness is not something to be ashamed of. It's not a lowly or a childish or a hedonistic pursuit. It's something noble because the pursuit of true happiness is not a grasping kind of pursuit. It involves developing qualities of wisdom, purity, compassion. The wisdom to realize that you're going to have to depend on yourself for your happiness, and that the happiness that's worth working toward is a long-term happiness, not a short-term. From that realization grows compassion. The understanding that other people want happiness, too, and if your happiness depends on their sewering, they're not going to let your happiness be long-term. They're going to try to cut it short. So if you want a long-term happiness, you can't harm other people. And then purity comes from actually looking at your actions, your thoughts, your words, and your deeds to see where your action cause harm, either for yourself or for others, and then learning how to avoid that harm. So the pursuit of happiness, if you conduct it properly, leads to noble qualities in the mind. That way you become a refuge, both for yourself and for others. You join the noble Sangha and become a refuge to other people in the sense that you become an example to them as well, so they can learn how to feed and strengthen themselves. This is how the Dhamma is passed on. So even though our pursuit may be for something very private and individual, the way we pursue this happiness, this skill that enables us not to suffer even through illness or death, we take care of a part of ourselves that no one else can reach. If we don't take care of this, what do? We thrash around, placing burdens on other people and leaving them miserable because they see ultimately that they can't help our suffering either, deep down inside. But if you learn how to take care of that part inside you, you've taken care of your responsibility. And then whatever gifts you have for other people, you can offer them freely. They're not offered in exchange for, you take care of me, and I'll take care of you. The attitude is, here, look, take this. I don't need it anymore. That's a very different kind of relationship. It doesn't come with a quid pro quo of, okay, I'll be nice to you, and you'll be nice to me. It's simply, here, take. But the Buddha goes beyond even the here, take. This is my body offered to you. He says, come and look. This is how you can learn how to feed yourself from within, how you can learn how to grow strong, so that ultimately you don't need to feed anymore. It's probably the greatest gift there is. In keeping with the Buddha's teachings, we underscore the profound significance of disseminating wisdom extensively. Today, we've converted this voluminous 1,000-page tome into an easily accessible audio format. Now, the responsibility to further this noble cause rests with you. Through your subscriptions, likes, and content shares, you play a pivotal role in the widespread distribution of these teachings, benefiting countless others. Let's uphold the age-old tradition of sharing knowledge and fostering mindfulness for the greater good of humanity. We invite you to join us in this mission, and together, we can create a profound impact on the lives of many.